All right, with that, we'd like to turn it over to our brother Jesse to go ahead and lead us through our Sunday school class on the subject of the Nethinim. Brother Jesse? Okay, well, welcome back, brothers and sisters and young people. This afternoon, we're going to be looking at really sort of an obscure people in the Bible, and they're known as the Nethinim. And maybe if we asked ourselves sort of a mental question, okay, how much do I know about the Nethinim? Like, who were these people? Because they really only pop up in sort of these obscure passages in the Old Testament. And perhaps when we were doing the readings, if you're anything like me, the Nethinim are sort of that instance in the readings where you read it, and you think, boy, wouldn't I love to find out who those people are, but that's going to have to wait for another day. You know that feeling? Well, I think, and I hope that you'll appreciate as we go through this, that this is one of those instances where we read of these people called the Nethinim, and today, God willing, in our Sunday school, we're actually going to consider them so we can go away from Sunday school this morning with the capabilities to answer who the Nethinim were. So, by way of sort of our agenda, here's what we're going to try and cover for our Sunday school this morning. We're going to try and answer the question, well, who were they? Okay? So if someone came up to you at the end of this class and you say, who were the Nethinim? God willing, if we work together in our Bible study and looking at who they were, we might be able to say, well, I know who they were. So you could answer the question, well, who were they? And also, you could answer the question, well, what did they do? So not only do I know who they were, I could also answer, what did they do? And then the third question at the bottom, as you see, is, well, where do they live? Now that's going to bring us into some exhortations, because where they lived, coupled with who they were and what they did, but where they lived specifically, really has some marvelous exhortations that come out for us in the life of this group of individuals. Okay, so I think anytime you start a study, really on a word, you really want to obviously pull out maybe some dictionaries and find out, well, what does this word mean, okay? So the word Nethinim, it's this one, it comes from this one, Nephim, and it means one given. So the word Nethinim in the Hebrew is Nephim, and it means one given. Now, is there a Nathan in the audience? So Nathan, for example, your name means, what does it mean? Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, gift, sorry. I thought I said yeah. So Nephim, or our English Nethinim, comes from the word Nathan, or Nathan, which means to give or gift. Okay? So when we look at this word Nethinim, it means one given. So this idea, as soon as we look it up in our Bible dictionaries, we have this idea that this individual or a group of individuals are ones who are given. Okay? Now, another good thing to do when you approach sort of a word study is you want to look up, okay, how much does it appear in the Scriptures? And this actually will be sort of your fork in the road on some studies. Because you look it up in the Bible dictionary, and with a study like this, you say, okay, 18 occurrences, that's a manageable study. Now you do a word study on, like, let's say, peace, and you got like 100 plus occurrences, you think, wow, I better set aside some time. So fortunately for us, we don't have a word study like peace. We have a simple one where it's only 18 occurrences. But what's interesting is it only occurs in 1 Chronicles, the book of Ezra, and Nehemiah. So just pause for a moment and think, okay, what do I know about 1 Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah? And I've been told that we can do Sunday school sort of informal, like we can have questions or comments from those sitting in the pews. So I just throw it out to the class, one or two things that you might know about either 1 Chronicles, Ezra, or Nehemiah in terms of the people who are in it, the themes, what was going on in the time of Israel. So that's an open question. Please shout out if you have an answer. Excellent. So we look at particularly Ezra and Nehemiah, and we have the time of the exiles. Maybe another couple comments?
Rebuilding a wall.
Yeah, they're building a wall, so they needed workers for that wall, absolutely. Absolutely. So they faced a lot of hardship and difficulty in setting about in those accomplishments. Now, First Chronicles, this is sort of a little tougher question. What are the first chapters of First Chronicles? What are those chapters? Genealogy. Absolutely. So the genealogies. Okay. So let's open our Bibles to First Chronicles chapter 9. So we're coming to First Chronicles chapter 9, which is one of the three books that this word Nethinim appears in. And we should have in our mind, okay, this is going to be a genealogy of peoples. Thank you very much for those comments also. Okay, so we'll begin reading at verse 1 in 1 Chronicles chapter 9. Now this is, 1 Chronicles chapter 9 is the first occurrence of this word Nethinim. Okay, so it's always good to look up the first and the last. 1 Chronicles 9 is the first. We're going to go to Nehemiah 11 in a moment, and that's the last. So give us a good understanding of these people. Verse 1 of 1 Chronicles chapter 9. And so all Israel were reckoned by genealogies, and behold, they were written in the book of the kings of Israel and of Judah, and who were carried away to Babylon for their transgression. So here we have a little reminder of Ezra and Nehemiah and the carrying away of the captives in exile. Verse 2, Now the first inhabitants that dwelt in their possessions in their cities were 1 the Israelites, 2 the priests, 3 the Levites, and 4 the Nethinim. So I might just make a pause here, and I'd recommend in your margin putting Nethinim equals 1 given. So now at least somewhere in our Bibles, if someone says, well, what does Nethinim mean? We can always go back to the first occurrence, and we have Nethinim 1 given. It's always good to put that into our Bibles. Okay, so what we've just been told in verse 1 and 2 is that the first inhabitants that dwelt in their possessions in their cities were these 4 groups. So what I would say is we've just discovered who the Nethinim worked with. Okay, so we've just discovered that the Nethinim, when they are introduced in Scripture, they're introduced with the Israelites, with the priests, and with the Levites. That's going to be very important as we go forward. So it's almost as if the Scripture is telling us, when you think of the Nethinim, I want you also to think of the priests and of the Levites. So this answers the question, who the Nethinim worked with. Okay, now let's come to the second passage on the screen, which is Nehemiah chapter 11. And we're going to establish another fact about the Nethinim. So just to repeat, we've just looked in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, who the Nethinim worked with, priests and Levites. Now we're going to find out where the Nethinim worked. Okay? So we're here in Nehemiah chapter 11, and we're going to just read at verse 20. Now here it says, continuing on the theme of the exiles returning, the residue of Israel, of the priests and the Levites, were in all the cities of Judah, everyone in his inheritance. But the Nethinim dwelt in Ophel, and Zihah and Gispa were over the Nethinim. So, here's what we've just found out in the last occurrence of the word Nethinim in our Bibles, is that we're told that the Nethinim dwelt in Ophel. And so this answers the question, where the Nethinim worked. So the first passage we just looked at, 1 Chronicles chapter 9, who the Nethinim worked with. And in Nehemiah chapter 11, verses 20 and 21, where the Nethinim worked. Okay? Okay, I'll throw this out to the class as well. Where is Ophel? Or O-P-H-E-L. I might be saying it wrong, but I say Ophel because it sounds better than awful. So where is Ophel? Yeah, it's south of something, but not necessarily in the country of Judah. Any other guesses? Where might Ophel be? It's one of those times where we flip back in the back of our Bibles, in our maps, and think, oh, is it in there? I hope it is. Now, personally it is. Now, come back to the back of your Bibles just before I reveal the answer. Let's see if it's actually in our Bibles. Okay, so look for a map of Jerusalem, and that'll give you a big hint. So flip back into the back. Let's sort of utilize the resources there. Find a map of Jerusalem. First person to find it, please go ahead and just locate it for the class. Yeah, Mike?
It seems to be right above the original city of David.
Absolutely. And therefore, just south of the temple. Okay, so we just did a little reconnaissance into our maps, and we found out that where the Nethinim worked was just tucked southward of the temple. And that's a key detail, particularly when we think of who they worked with and where they worked. So we can get this idea in our minds, even before we ventured further into our study, that the Nethinim, they worked with the priests and with the Levites, and where they worked was in Ophel, which was just south of the temple itself. Okay? So we're starting to piece together who these people were, also what they did and where they lived. Okay, just before we get into a little activity, I just want to mention also that when we find in the 18 occurrences of the Nethinim, there's two rules to remember. That the word always has the definite article in it. Okay, a definite article is the, as opposed to maybe an indefinite article as a. Sorry, that's a little English for you. But the Nethinim always have the Nethinim before. Okay, the definite article, the word the, is always there. So they're being distinguished as a particular group. Now the second rule to consider is that the Nethinim never occurs singular. There's always more than one. So two things. There's always the Nethinim, definite article, the distinguished group, and the group is always a group. It's never a singular individual. Okay? So just something to keep in mind as we go forward. Okay, so we'll do a little sort of fun activity. I hope it's fun. I'm going to put up a word on the screen like this, which is jumbled together, and you're going to have to shout out what that word is, because now we're looking at, in our Bible, words that end in I-M, which are plural, because the I-M ending suggests that it's plural. So here are a bunch of I-M words in our Bible. When you have figured out what the jumbled letters are, just shout it out. Elohim, perfect. So here we have the word Elohim. Yeah, cherubim or cherubim. I heard it. Yes, shiddim, exactly. So here we have shiddim. Yes, seraphim. So you probably noticed that I've actually corrected the English, because you don't need an extra S on an already plural word. I heard it. Yes, seraphim. Yep, and last one? Dalman. Oh, that was easy, right? Because Urim and Dalman always go together. Okay. So here is just a list of words in our Bible where they're rendered with the I-M ending in our English, and this gives us a good indication that this suggests that they're plural. And so that helps us when we look at Nethinim, or Nethinim, depending on how you say it, with the I-N ending, it's always going to suggest to us that these individuals, this group, is a plural group, okay? I see some trying to write them down. I do have to move on, but by all means, I'll leave it up here after the Sunday school, and you can flip through if you need to. Okay? So we're going to take a look at sort of a map which is provided just to reestablish where Ophel is. Now, Ophel, if you're still in Nehemiah, you can take the chance to write next to verse 21, but the Nethinim dwelt in Ophel. You can write that Ophel means the high place or ascend. So that's what Ophel means. So if you're in Nehemiah chapter 11, verses 21, you can still write in your margin, Ophel means the high place or ascend. And as we've already demarcated it out, it's the southeast side of the Temple Mount. So here we have, and as Mike, I believe, correctly identified, just north of the old city of David. So here we have the Temple Mount with its surrounding walls, and here we have this sort of vicinity area of Ophel. Okay? And the idea was when you were coming through Ophel, you would be gradually going up to the Temple Mount. And we're going to see that that's really significant. I personally have not been to the Holy Land, but many who have told me that when they go to the Holy Land, the geography of the places really emphasizes what took place there. And so if you lived in the vicinity of Ophel and you were going up to the Temple Mount, your mind would be elevated to godly thinking. You'd be going up to a place of God's presence, as it were, into the temple, and these Nethinim would be going up, understanding what their duties were in Ophel. Okay? Now here is an actual structure just near Jerusalem, and this gives you sort of a better visual with the 3D dimensions. So here we have sort of the old city of David, which is down here, and then we have this vicinity up here with Ophel, and then here we have the south wall of the Temple Mount. This gentleman here with the, I believe that's the gentleman there with the yellow shirt, gives you an idea of where the temple would be. So here we have the south wall of the Temple Mount, Kidron Valley, and here in this vicinity is an Ophel. Now, sort of as a show of hands, if you had the opportunity, wouldn't you mind living in Ophel? I sure would. Am I the only one? Oh, okay, good. It's not a trick question, but if you had an opportunity to move into a particular area in Israel, this would be a very coveted place. So, oh yeah, I live in Ophel. Oh, you live in Ophel? Oh wow! What's it like? I tried to get in there for many years. I can't get in there. So that's the sort of place when we think of Ophel. It's a very coveted, but it bears a lot of responsibility. And as we're going to see as we continue through, that's exactly the case with this place and who lived there. Okay, just moving on. We're coming now further. Now we're bird's eye view into the temple. And I want to point out just a few things as it pertains to the Nethinim. Okay? So here we have sort of a front facing of what they believe the temple looked like. Here's sort of a backed up view with the women's court, then moving into the inner court with the temple. But here we have just the bird's eye view of all of this. Okay? And I want to point out these 4 storage rooms that sort of sat on the corners of the women's court. Okay? Now, what we have is we have like a Nazarite court. So a Nazarite would come, fulfill his vow. It's believed that the Apostle Paul would have gone in there when he had returned with the 4 gentlemen in Acts chapter 20 or 21, I believe. Here we have the leper's chamber court. So you get the idea that when Jesus cleansed the 10 lepers and the one came back, he would have said, "Go to the leper's court, show thyself unto the priest," and he would have been admitted back into fellowship, as it were. But particularly with the Nethinim, here we have a little room, a corner room, where wood was to be brought. Okay, so we're going to tuck that away. We remember that wood was to be brought, particularly into one of these rooms, and oil and water were supposed to be brought into a place here. Okay, so we've got wood, we've got oil and water being brought into at least 2 of those 4 storage rooms. Okay, so now let's come back to Joshua chapter 9. And now we're really going to sort of introduce ourselves to who these Nethinim were. Has there been a question that's come up yet? If you want to ask it, feel free to. No? Okay. I know it's always a little nerve-wracking to ask a question in a large group, but if you do have one, by all means, please go ahead and ask. Okay, so Joshua 9, before you look down in your Bibles, it's always good custom when you open up a chapter of the Bible, think, what do I know that's in that chapter? It's fine if you don't know anything, but just sort of test yourself. It's always a little fun test. So, what is in Joshua chapter 9? What's that event? Absolutely. Did you have the Gibeonites? Absolutely. The Gibeonites. There's always a little fun thing to do when you're turning to a chapter and think, what do I know about that chapter? If you don't know anything, that's fine, but when you get there, you find out, right? But if you find out before, it's always a little fun little game. And it sort of builds our memory aids of the Bible and the events in it. Okay, so we're going to look at the Gibeonites. And you might be saying, okay, well, why are we looking at the Gibeonites? We're going to see in a few moments exactly why we're looking at the Gibeonites and how it pertains to who the Nethinim were. Okay, so we'll read at Joshua 9, and here's what we read at verse 3. When the inhabitants of Gibeon, which means hilly, when the inhabitants of Hilly heard that Joshua had done, or what Joshua had done unto Jericho and Ai, they did work wildly. Okay, so here's what the Gibeonites did. They're from a place in verse 3 which means hilly, and they heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai. In verse 4 it says that they did work wildly. Now the word wildly means trickery or discretion. There's a bit of a paradox in what that word means, because it means trickery, and that's not a good thing, but it also means discretion, and that is a good thing. We'll see a few passages in a moment, but I just wanted to give you the definition. So, they did work wily means trickery or discretion. Verse 4, and went and made as if they had been ambassadors, and took old sacks upon their donkeys, and wine bottles, old and rent and bound up, and old shoes, and clouted upon their feet, and old garments upon them, and all the bread of their provision was dry and mouldy. And they went to Joshua, verse 6, unto the camp at Gilgal, and said unto him, and to the men of Israel, you just have to imagine, these Gibeonites would have put on as best a face as possible. It was only a couple days' journey from Gibeon to Gilgal. And they would have like dry mouth, sort of saggy eyes, one's fainting in the corner, the donkey's like, ooh. And here's what they say to Joshua in verse 6. We be come from a far country. Now therefore, make a league with us. You see, that's how they would have said it. They wouldn't have said, oh, we become, just skipped over from Gibeon, we're in the neighborhood, just want to introduce you. Here's a fruit basket. It wasn't anything like that. It was like they put on a face. Now, was this trickery or was this discretion? Okay, I asked that to you now. You don't have to answer it right now. Were they being trickery? Were they tricking them, or were they using discretion? Okay, so we'll find out the answer in just a few moments. Okay, so just to give an idea of where these Gibeonites came from, here we have Jericho, so the River Jordan in this vicinity. Here we have Jericho, and Gilgal was just up on Jericho, okay, and that seemed to be the camp of Israel when they crossed over the Jordan River. So when we look over here, we have Gibeon, and it says specifically, it says that in verse 3, that the Gibeonites had heard what was done unto Jericho and unto Ai. As you can almost just imagine what the Gibeonites are thinking. They're thinking, Jericho, the great city, fell, and I heard it didn't even take any sword or arrow or anything. Perhaps it was like a miracle, we're told. Then Ai, they had a good fight, but eventually they got destroyed. Wow, we are probably next. So here's the Gibeonites, and they're taking these calculations of what looks like it's going to transpire. They get ahead, they be proactive, and they come to Joshua in their guise, and they try and form a league with Joshua. Okay, so here's what they say in verse 6 at the end. They say, now therefore make ye a league with us. Now I want to give you a cross-reference to put in your margin. Genesis 17 in verse 2, that word league is rendered covenant. So I'll repeat that. Genesis 17 and verse 2, that word league is rendered covenant. And so this is a serious request. This is not to be taken lightly on the side of Joshua and Israel, because that word league is rendered covenant in Genesis 17 verse 2. And so they're asking for a significant thing to be done for them. Now, what happens? Verse 14, it says, "And the men took of their victuals and asked not counsel at the mouth of God." So here's maybe an obvious lesson, but one of which we overlook. Right? We have a big decision to make. We sort of look at the facts, maybe we draw up a pros, cons, and we jump in, and we think, oops, got to do something vitally important. The same thing happens here with Joshua and the men of Israel. It says they asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord. So here's like a foreshadowing. And it says in verse 15, "And Joshua made peace with them, and made a league with them to let them live, and the princes of the congregation swear unto them." So Joshua and the men of Israel are hook, line, and sinker, you might say. They made a covenant with them. And verse 16 says, "And it came to pass at the end of 3 days after they made a league with them, that they heard that they were their neighbors, and that they dwelt among them." So it's almost like they make this covenant in Gilgal. We do a reconnaissance mission about a day and a half. We're like, They do a day and a half reconnaissance mission back in a huff and a puff, and they say, "Joshua, you realize what we just did? We disobeyed the Lord's commandment to get rid of all these people. In fact, we made a league with the next city you're about to attack." And so now they're in a conundrum, Joshua and the people of Israel. And it's only 3 days have gone on, and they realize the error of their ways. So, here's what happens. Joshua, he decides that he's going to do something with these Gibeonites. And this is in verse 22. It says, "And Joshua called for the Gibeonites, and he spake unto them, saying, Wherefore have ye beguiled us, saying, We are very far from you, when ye dwell among us? Now therefore you are cursed, and there shall none of you be freed from being bondmen." So you just imagine Joshua, he's almost like speaking through his teeth, because he's so angry at these people, but he realizes he's made a covenant with them. He realized he was in the air, but he realized that he has a covenant to keep. He really doesn't want to keep it. He's like, so here's what he does. At the end of verse 23, he says, "Hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God." So here's what they're going to be. He says, Gibeonites, you're going to be hewers of wood, and you're going to be drawers of water for the house of my God. So what Joshua just told them is you're going to be bringing wood for the altar to have the fire, and you're going to be bringing water for the lavers for the administration of the priests and the Levites. So I'll ask you a question. Does this seem an awful, sorry to use the word awful, but does this seem like the Gibeonites and the Nethinim are almost one and the same? Good. If you shook your head either physically or in your mind, you're right. Because what we're establishing is that here are these Gibeonites, they're being told they're going to be bondmen, they're going to be serving in the temple, they're going to be bringing wood, they're going to be bringing water, and they're going to be serving the priests and the Levites. So we've just got sort of a major puzzle piece, because what we have, what we've just read in Joshua 9, is the Gibeonites actually become the first Nethinim. Now I'll explain it in a simpler way. The Nethinim were not like a nationality. Okay? So the Nethinim were not like Americans or Canadians. The Nethinim were immigrants. Does that help, that distinction? So don't think of the Nethinim like they came from Nephith or something, or the city of Nephith or something. They were immigrants which were being brought in and absorbed into a particular nationality. In this case, that particular nationality was the people of Israel. So the Gibeonites come in. They are now the Nethinim, which are immigrants, immigrating into the people of Israel. And their job was to collect wood, bring in water, and they were a conquered people put into manual labor. Okay, now I promised you that we would look at this word wily as a very fascinating word. So come with me to, let's go to Proverbs 8, verse 12. This is another occurrence of this word wily. Okay, so Proverbs 8, verse 12. And I'll sort of just ask that question again. Do you think that their wily behavior was trickery or discretion? Okay? maybe we'll have a comment or two. So we're coming to Proverbs chapter 8, and here we're going to find the exact same word, wily, that we read in Joshua 9, verse 3. Proverbs 8, verse 12. Woman wisdom is speaking. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence and find out knowledge of witty inventions. Now, our word is the word prudence. Okay? So that word prudence in Proverbs 8 and verse 12 is the same word that we looked at in Joshua 9 and verse 4, 9 and verse 4 as wily. So here woman wisdom is saying, I dwell with prudence or discretion. So there's a good occurrence of that word, the word that we want to ascribe to. Now, just come with me to Exodus chapter 21. Here is the other occurrence where it's not in a good sense. Exodus chapter 21. And we're looking at another occurrence where wily is translated in our Bibles. So Exodus chapter 21. And verse 14. It says, but if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, that's our word, thou shalt take him from mine altar that he may die. So this word in verse 14 of Exodus 21 is the word guile. It's our word wily in Joshua chapter 9 and verse 4. Okay? So we've looked at the Proverbs account where woman wisdom says, I dwell with prudence. And we've also looked in Exodus 21 where it says, the man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay a man with guile. So, I'll ask the question. Here with the Gibeonites, what is your opinion on this word wily? Were they using discretion or were they using trickery? They avoided death? Yep. Absolutely, it does depend on whose perspective it is. Tricky discretion. A very political answer. How about some other thoughts? Discretion or trickery? Oh, with the serpent and subtlety? My guess is it might be. I don't have it in my notes, so I'm going to say I don't know. Yeah. Okay, you want the answer? Ben and I agree. It's both. And I'm going to show you why it's both in a few moments, okay? And I like what Brian said, because it does depend on whose perspective. But what we're going to look at as we go through in the time we have remaining, I'm going to say it's both. And I'll clarify why I say it's both. I won't just leave you sort of hanging. Okay, what I want to do is sort of move into another vein of thought, and I want to cover 3 other groups that were also conquered, put into service, and became Nethinim, became immigrants into Israel. Okay, so come with me to Ezra chapter 2. So here's where sort of, although they're very difficult and sometimes funny to read, genealogies are very helpful in sort of piecing together puzzle pieces of a particular study sometimes. So Ezra chapter 2, here's what we read in verse 1. It says in verse 1 of Ezra 2, now these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity, of those which had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away unto Babylon. And came again unto Jerusalem and Judah, every one unto his city. And just flip over to verse 50. The children of Asna, the children of Mehunim, and the children of Nephushim. So here we have in verse 50 2 words, Mehunim and Nephushim, which end in an I-M. So this is giving us, as the reader, an indication that this is most likely a plural people. Okay? So we're going to look at both these 2 groups of people, the Mehunim and the children of Nephushim. Now they're reckoned in the genealogy of those who return to Judah and Jerusalem. So that's going to give us an idea of where they're heading. So come with me to 2 Chronicles, which is not too far, chapter 26. And we're going to look at the Nethinim. Second Chronicles chapter 26. Verse 3 tells us what time period we're in. It says, 16 years old was Uzziah when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. And just scan down to verse 7. Here's what happened in the days of Uzziah. And God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians that dwelt in Gurbaal and the Mehunim. Okay, so here's these people. They're classified as the Mehunim. And what happens is Uzziah goes out against various groups, but particularly against this group, the Mehunim, and he conquers them. So what happens to the Mehunim is they're now conquered. They're living in the region of Mount Seir, and they're brought in, and Uzziah is going to do as he wishes with them, make them bondmen. Okay? So these are conquered people being brought in as immigrants into Israel, put into service, as it were. Okay, so here's the Mehunim. Now let's look at the Nephushim. So 1 Chronicles chapter 5. First Chronicles chapter 5. We're into the genealogy sections of 1 Chronicles. We're going to be looking at a descendant of Hagar. Okay, all the way down from Hagar. We're going to be looking at the Nephushim coming from Hagar. 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 18. It says in verse 18, and the sons of Reuben and of the Gadites and of the half-tribe of Manasseh, of valiant men, men able to bear buckler and sword, and to shoot with bow and skillful in war, were 40,703 that went out to war. And here's what verse 19 says. And they made war with the Hagarites, with Jetur, with Nephish, and Nodab. So here what we have is we have the Nephish and the Hagarites connected as a people which went out to war. And that Nephish is our word that we looked at in Ezra chapter 2, the Nephushim. So I'll just spell it for you if you want it. Nephusim. So here are those people. They went out to war against Israel. They got conquered. And now they've been immigrated into the nationality of Israel. Okay, we're going to look at the last one, and then I'll throw just a review slide up after we look at this last one. Come to Numbers chapter 31, and we'll look at the third and final one in Numbers 31, the Midianites. Okay, so here we have the Midianites. Numbers 31, verse 1. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, verse 2 of Numbers 31, avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites, and afterward thou shalt be gathered unto my people. And what do they do? Verse 47 of Numbers 31. Here's what happens. Even of the children of Israel's half, Moses took one portion of 50, both of man and of beast, and gave them unto the Levites, which kept the charge of the tabernacle of the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. So what happened? At the beginning of the chapter, God says, I want you to avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites, and they do. And in verse 47, it says that Moses took one portion of them, 50, both man and beast, and he Nathan, the word Nathan, and he Nathan them unto the Levites. He gifted them, as that word in verse 47 gave is rendered. It's the Hebrew word Nathan, which means a gift or to give. And he Nathan them unto the Levites, which kept the charge of the tabernacle of the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. So what have we just looked at, okay? We've just looked at three groupings of people, which are distinguished by their names, by their group. We looked at the Mehunim, we looked at the Nephushim, and we looked at the Midianites. And we looked at how, in these instances, these particular groupings of people, They went out against Israel, they lost, they were conquered, they were brought in, and in various times they were put to the service of the house of God to serve the Levites and the priests. Okay? So you might say that they were no longer known as the Nethinim, they were just now bondmen in Israel. And what happens is they became Nethinim, ones given. Good. I see some head shaking. Okay, that's good. We're going to skip a section due to time, and we'll just sort of fast forward. Come with me to Ezra chapter 8, and we'll sort of bring our thoughts to a close. I think let's see, we have about 6 minutes. So Ezra chapter 8. Because I really want to sort of leave us with the idea of how this really pertains to us. Okay? So Ezra chapter 8, and here's what we have. Here's what we find in Ezra 8 and at verse 20. What had happened is, you remember Doeg had massacred a lot of the Levites and the priests. Doeg, the time of David. So David had acted, and what he had done, as it says in verse 20 of Ezra 8, also of the Nethinim, whom David and the princes had appointed, the word appointed is Nathan, to give, for the service of the Levites, 220 Nethinim, all of them were expressed by name. So what happened with David is he recognized that there was a loss in the Nethinim, the ones who were serving the Prevites and the Levites and the priests, and he gave extra Nethinim, bondmen, immigrants into Israel, unto the service of the Levites. Okay? Now what they were supposed to do is they're supposed to bring wood and water. They're supposed to bring wood for the altar and water for the ministration of the Levites and the priests. Now the exhortation is it's a menial job. If you've ever cut up a tree with an axe or something and carried wood, I remember I used to do that at our farmhouse, at our family farmhouse. I used to just bring in wood, dump it down, bring in wood, dump it down. And there's one thing that I could not stand about that job, and it was this. In the farmhouse, I don't know why, but they had like a door that was like 5 feet high. Okay, to get into the basement where the wood needed to be stored 5 feet high. I'm about 6 foot 3 1/4 inches, as my family likes to remind me, so about 6'1". And I have this pile of wood, and I'd be walking, boom, right on the crown of your head. I always duck, but I always pick it like twice a time. And it was brutal. And it reminded me of such a menial task. But see, the Nethinim, the bondmen, they were brought in for a menial task, but the fact of where they were doing it is the great significance. Okay, so I want to finish off in Nehemiah chapter 10. So Nehemiah chapter 10. Okay, so remember when I asked you, was it discretion or was it trickery? And Benjamin, top of the class, marks, he said both. It was both. Because what they did, from God's perspective, was lie. And that's always wrong. So that was trickery. That was their guile. But their discretion was that, as was mentioned, was that they were saved alive. And because the Gibeonites were brought in to be the Nethinim, servants of the house of God, here's what their blessing was way down the track. Okay? All the descendants, the Nethinimish people, the immigrants into the house of Israel, here's what they received. We find it in Nehemiah chapter 10. Nehemiah chapter 10 is all of the catalog of individuals who signed the covenant. Okay? We've already established that the Nethinim were in exile and they returned with the people to Judah and Jerusalem. Okay? So the Nethinim are here in Nehemiah chapter 10. And here's what we read. The covenant is being signed by all the listed people. It says in verse 28, the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinim, and all they that have separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, everyone having knowledge and having understanding. Now here's what we've just been told. When the covenant was signed, guess who signed the covenant? The bondmen who were the Nethinim in the house of God. And so I say both because yes, they lied, but what came about is they were brought into the hope of Israel. So much so that they have their name in the catalog of people who signed the covenant. And what that tells us is that they had forsaken their old ways, they've been brought into Israel, and they had embraced the covenant. And what I find remarkable is that they were given such a menial task like bearing wood and bearing water, but what that offered them was salvation. Because I think really one of the lessons for us is that service in the house of our God, though menial at times, but we receive the salvation of God. Now, if we can, let's just come quickly to Psalm 84. I'll try and wrap up in like 2 minutes. Psalm 84. We mentioned how that Ophel was a very coveted place to live, and it was, because you're right in the vicinity of the temple. So Psalm 8 is what's called a Psalm of Ascent. Okay, so the children of Israel, when they went up to the three feasts, the 3 set times, Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths, Tabernacles, they would sing this song, and they would go up to Jerusalem. And here's what they would sing. Okay, they would sing verse 1. How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts! My soul longeth, yea, even fainteth for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God. And so all the children of Israel, when they're going up to the feast, they'd be singing this. They'd come down from the various tribes in the north 3 times maybe a year. They'd come to the various feasts. And they loved coming to the temple of God, even unto the courts. And they would say, oh, how I love them. My heart and my flesh, they crieth out for them. And look what it says in verse 4. Blessed are they that dwell in thy house. They will be still praising thee. And look what it says in verse 10. It's a famous quoted verse. It says in verse 10, for a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. And what's so special about Psalm 84 is all these children of Israel would be singing this psalm as they went up to the 3 feasts, and guess who was awaiting them when they arrived in the temple? The Nephilim. With wood on their shoulders and water in their hands, menial tasks, but they got to live where all of Israel envied. And I think the lesson for us is we are called to be bondmen, aren't we? We're called to do these menial tasks in ecclesial life, and there's plenty of them. But the place of which we dwell, the house of God, the house of the living God, is a coveted place. And just as the Nephilim forsake their old ways and they immigrated into the hope of Israel, they were given a marvelous blessing. So when we think of the Nethinim, we really think of ourselves. We have no nationality to hold ourselves to. We have no old ways to go back to. We've been conquered, as it were, by the living God, brought into a family of Israel that we might have the hope of Israel, and yet still called to do menial tasks. It's a great service. And that's really what the Nethinim are all about. You and I, brothers and sisters and young people, servants in the house of God. And I encourage you to go through Psalm 84 and just think of the Nethinim as they were hearing, as the children of Israel were coming up the stairs to the Temple Mount into Jerusalem, and hearing how that was the place that they lived, where people long to be in the house of God. Okay?